Anybody got a question this morning they wanted to bring up? Yeah, well, Andrew.
So in my Bible reading,
Make sure I turned that on.
In my Bible reading, I was going through 1 Samuel 15, and Samuel makes an important statement to Saul, and I just wanted to know how far this goes. So in 1 Samuel 15, verse 29, he says, kind of in rebutting Saul after he tears his robe, he says, "Also the glory of Israel will not lie or change his mind, for he is not a man that he should change his mind." And my question is that a general statement throughout the entirety of the Bible, and that's kind of just a clear statement of fact? And if so, how does that, I guess, engage with the conversation that Abraham has with the angel of the Lord in regards to Sodom and Gomorrah and the righteous people, as well as Moses and the destruction of Israel and whatnot? And just want to get your thoughts.
Yeah. Sometimes that section is translated that he's not a man that he should repent. See, which I think is a little bit better, closer to the meaning, and I think that clarifies, your question. See, because, God doesn't have to repent for anything. Man has to change his mind, or that is, he has to repent. So I think that's the thrust of that verse. Okay? Good. Anything else? Another question this morning. Going once? Okay.
Is the repentance, when you say that, that's changing in the way you think.
Yes.
And so God obviously never has to change the way he thinks, but as circumstances, if people change, if people repent, then God can change the direction without, it's still consistent with his character of thinking.
Yes.
And so that's why, so.
Yeah.
Okay.
See, the people of Nineveh are a good example. See, when they actually repented, then God changed his mind about what he was planning to do to Nineveh. Now, it didn't change his direction. It just, their response then. And again, if there had been, 5 righteous people in Sodom and Gomorrah, they'd have survived, but there weren't. So, and God's not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance, God desires all men to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth. So it isn't that God's trying to close off doors. God's trying to open doors up. And so if man changes, if you think about it, our personal trajectory before we were immersed into Christ, where was that going to go? So aren't you glad that God's willing to change his mind in that sense toward us? It wasn't actually overall directed change of mind, but we were lost, and had we continued on that path, there'd be an eternity of the lake of fire for all of us. So that's a good overall description. Other questions or thoughts or comments here? Any other questions? Going twice? 3 times she's gone. Okay. All right. So let's go back to the book of Genesis, and I want to go to chapter 11. What I'm working on here a little bit is how God has injected himself and his information into mankind. We spent a little bit of time last week talking about how the world, through its wisdom, didn't come to know God. See, and that, like I say, man, through the processes of observation and reason, can understand quite a bit about the physical creation. We've been able to discover the natural laws. Great example of that was Newton sitting underneath a fig tree and got hit by an apple. Caused him to process what gravity was. Okay, a process of reason, observation coupled with reason, developed the law of gravity. The law of gravity was already there, but it wasn't until he got hit on the head with an apple that he started figuring that out. Because you're right in the middle of gravity. See, he started thinking, what caused that apple to come down from the tree? See, so mankind has been able to develop this, legitimate thing called science, through the processes of observation and reason. But I do have to throw a side comment on here. Quote, science, unquote, by consensus is not science. Okay? That is propaganda. Because if it's fact, okay, the law of gravity doesn't need a consensus. Okay? If you want to test it, just go to the top of the tallest building in Bozeman and try her out. See how long it takes you to get to the bottom. You know, you can actually calculate that, all right? See, science doesn't need consensus. And so when you've got science by a consensus, as it's going on right now, what you're witnessing is the death of science. Actually witnessing the death of it. And, I saw something the other day that, because there's been quite a number of these guys that are infectious disease experts and, some of the good guys, Dr. Robert Malone and stuff, they said, hey, look, these vaccines are dangerous. They're untested. They're unproven. Could be a lot of side effects. Well, the consensus of sciences is that, there's no harm to the vaccines, okay? And, that football player that had cardiac arrest, okay, you're not allowed to ask the question, was he vaccinated? See, that you can't even ask that question, because the consensus is, see, so, but real science, always points to an orderly God in an orderly creation, but you can't know anything more about God than that. Mel?
The fact that you can't ask the question, you already got your answer.
Yeah, that's good point. You can't ask, you already got your answer. So God, the world through its wisdom can't know God. God has to inject himself into the affairs of mankind and develop what we know as a progressive revelation in the Bible. Okay, so we had the flood, and so when Noah and the family crawled off the boat, they knew something about God because God told them that the flood was coming. And so Noah, the Bible describes Noah as a preacher of righteousness. See, he's preaching all the time that ark's building, and mankind is just laughing him off. I was reading something out of 2 Chronicles the other day where just before the northern kingdom of Israel was destroyed, Hezekiah became the king of the southern kingdom, and so they started getting things back on track, getting the temple cleaned out, trying to reinstitute the sacrifices and the Passover and all those sort of things. Well, they were a little bit late. They couldn't get ready for have the Passover on the first month of the 14th day, so they decided to have it on the second month, 14th day, which God did allow that under certain circumstances. But Hezekiah and the guys decided, you know what, we're going to send messengers up to the northern kingdom, and anybody wants to come and join the Passover with us, they could. So some came, but when the messengers came through, in a lot of places they mocked them. They didn't listen. See, and that you can just see that going on in the human race. One of the ways of just discarding the argument, you mock the presenter. So Noah didn't get much traction. So all those guys that the descendants that came with Noah and his family, before long they started settling in the plain of Shinar, which became the location of Babylon. So in Genesis 11, you got the story of the Tower of Babel, okay? And you have a situation here where in verse 3 it says, let's make bricks. Burn them thoroughly. Let's use brick for stone. Let's use tar for mortar, okay? See, one of the things that God had always insisted all the way through is if you're going to make an altar for me, it's going to be uncut stones. Stones off the ground. And he said, I don't want any steps leading up to the altars, okay? See, because what happens, these guys always elevate themselves, don't they? See, and God says no steps. Okay, so what are these guys going to do? They're going to use human effort here, bricks they made, tar, and they are going to build themselves a tower to heaven. Well, God's not going to let that happen, is he? Because there's no man-made way to get to heaven. So he's got a plan in mind that's called to destroy this thing. No?
Well, if you know anything about tar, when it gets hot, it gets slippery. That doesn't make for a good building. Building a building with slippery tar.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of like the wrong plan of salvation. Pretty slippery, right? Good point. So it must have been some slick salesman that sold them on that. I don't know. But good point, Mel. So they scattered from the Tower of Babel. So what God used to scatter them, of course, is the fact that they spoke different languages and couldn't understand each other. Now it's pretty obvious right then something happened, right? You know, if you're talking to your first cousin and all of a sudden, you know, because you don't even know what sort of hand signals to use, right? So you have to have some verbal communication, you know, to try to get the idea of what sort of hand signals. You know, when the Indians used to use their sign language to communicate between the different tribes, someplace back in there's some verbal communication letting you know what the hand signals meant. Otherwise, you can't do it. When the sign language for the deaf, okay, again, there has to be communication, verbal communication, setting that up. So when you can't speak to one another, it's pretty obvious that something happened. Okay, and they got scattered. But what's really interesting is when they got scattered, they had a written language. You know, different sectors had totally different written language. The Egyptian hieroglyphics are totally different from, say, the Middle Eastern cuneiform, which is, say, totally different from the writings of the people of India, or totally different from the Chinese. So you can see as these guys are scattered from the Tower of Babel, and these guys are going east, they're, they have a written language, and that they either developed or that God, the fact that it's so different, indicates to me maybe God had a hand in it. I don't know. Okay, low bat. So we're getting verbal communication back there that says low bat. Thank you, sir. So, but see, they knew that God was involved. That's the point. They knew that God was involved.
So just to clarify, or from my understanding, did they have, so as they're leaving Babel, then you're saying that not only would these different people groups have had a verbal language, but they also would have had an accompanying written language from Babel.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
See, it's really interesting when, the archaeology type guys get into it. I've mentioned that years ago I was listening to our Larry King broadcast and on the radio before Red Suspenders took to the TV. And, of course, he's since passed on to his reward. That's what happens to people is they pass on to their reward, don't they? And but he was interviewing a guy that was an expert when prehistory became history. Okay, now prehistory, okay, that's a secular evolutionist type perspective. See that man, went from grunts and pointing, and eventually developed words like couch, to sit on. It's not too much of a move from grunt to couch. You can see how that would develop that way. But so that's their perspective. And so when Larry King started the interview, he asked the question. He said, "Would you say that ancient man was, say less intelligent than modern man? The idea that we've been progressing upwards from the apes, and the answer came back was, was a little bit of a pause there, because I don't think the guy expected that question. And he said, I would say this: ancient man was at least as intelligent as modern man. And then he said all the ancient languages are more complex than the modern languages. Now, that's a highly significant statement here, and it has to do with what we're talking about. See, it's when they were scattered from the Tower of Babel is when the ancient languages came into existence. It's at that same instant, see, because they're scattered. See, at that point, they're speaking different languages. That's where the guys in Akkad and Sumeria, that's when they developed the cuneiform. It's when the Egyptians developed the hieroglyphics. The Chinese character language goes way back, at least to 2500 BC. See, they have their languages. The fact that those languages appear instantaneously and very complex, would tell you something about where the author of that was.
How come it wasn't until 2000 AD that the technology and information has really taken off then?
Well, God has a sense of timing, okay? So the question has to do with, okay, how do we have all the computer and stuff? There's a lot of things that go into. Have you seen the computer museum? See, again, it's very hard to process what you're looking at when you go into the computer museum, because you're just looking at a box full of transistors, but it's hard to process the logarithmic. Some of us older guys, see, I can remember when we didn't even have copy machines. Okay, so Mrs. Lana Wilson used to, if a kid needed a redo on a checkup, she actually had to hand copy the checkup in order for Mr. Luke Wilson to redo that checkup that he didn't do a good job on. Okay, see, because we didn't have copy machines. Okay, I remember a cartoon that came out not too long after that. A guy busts in the back room. There's a couple guys back there with quill pens. And the guy has the message, said, "Sorry, boys, the boss just popped for a copy machine." In other words, you're out of a job. Well, that's a mega step. Well, what did it take to have copy machine? It took lasers, laser lights. And so the technology required to grow the crystals, and to be able to develop that. See, it's an incredible amount that goes into that. Same way, if you look at the chips, I think I mentioned my son John Mark just started a new job for Honeywell in Spokane, and they make the silicon chips, and then they impress the things on the silicon chips that are needed, and they can have a line that's one atom wide, down there at a nanotechnology level. See, again, you can't process the difference between 1 inch and 1 atom. See, it sounds parallel, but so what did it take to produce that? So you've had a tremendous exponential increase in things that basically, even without calculus, would have been impossible. See, modern engineering depends upon calculus. Now, the ancients did a lot of things, and you can tell they kind of did it by brute force and by experiments. The Romans invented the keystone, so they could make their arch bridges and stuff. And those arch bridges, there's a lot of them in Europe that's still standing. Okay, but they didn't do it by sitting down and running second order differential equations in order to figure out how much stress that bridge could take. They didn't have the mathematics, and you can look through. They didn't have the mathematics. So therefore, God waited till this time in history for all this technology to take off. Turn to Daniel chapter 12. The Wilson personal opinion on this is, the J. Wilson personal opinion is that this is God moving it toward the end very rapidly. Okay, it's moving exponentially faster, and it's global. Okay, and in Daniel chapter 12, he says in verse 4, he says, "As for you, Daniel, conceal these words and seal up the book until the end of time. Many will go back and forth, and knowledge will increase." Okay, so, he's looking to a time where there's a tremendous expansion in knowledge, and he's looking to a time when there's, we'll put it in these terms, ease of travel. Okay, it hadn't been that long ago. I was reading about Ezra here the other day. It took him 4 months to get from where he was in Babylon to Jerusalem. Okay, today you want to go to Babylon, what you do is you book a couple flights. You get from here to Dubai, and and a short hop into Babylon. You could be to Babylon in I'd say maybe 16, 18 hours. I mean, that'd be about par for, I think, depending on your connections. Okay? Why? Because you're not walking. Okay? When the guys sailed from England or Scotland to New Zealand, it took them 10 months, because it's exactly opposite the world. 10 months sailing to get there. They go either Atlantic or, one way or another, they're doing the Atlantic, go around Cape Horn, South America, or go around the Cape of Good Hope of Africa, sailing east or west. Either way, it's going to take them 10 months. Really nice weather, all the way. Okay. Rough. Travel was just tough. If you want to go to New Zealand today, you catch a flight from here to San Francisco, and a flight from San Francisco to Auckland. Not bad, huh? That's a lot. That's a lot of going back and forth. Okay, and the last couple of weeks you had two major things. You had a Southwest airline major glitch, and then you had the federal government have a major glitch, right? Shut down traffic for a while. What happens when the air traffic quits? 2 million passengers fly in and out of Bozeman every year? I'm Bob can't verbally answer, but yeah, over 2 million. We can't even process that. That's a lot of air travel. And I think it was this, because Lord's Day was January 1st. So the second was, of course, the end of the holiday, because everybody, if the holiday falls on a Lord's Day, then you get Monday off, right? Okay, there were 20 planes lined up on the, waiting in line to fly out of the. Anybody else besides me see that? Never. I'm stunned. There was a couple big commercials in the line, but boy, there were a bunch of private jets. Okay, all flying out of there. That just an illustration here. This is Bozeman, Montana, right? Not exactly the commercial center of the world, right? See, many go back and forth. The knowledge increase, okay? If I'm having a Bible study with you and I want to show you a picture of the Rylands Papyrus, to show you what the earliest document, it's a section of John, Gospel of John. It's a section of scroll. I think it's John 6 on one side and John 16 the other side, with the Greek capitals all in line, no spaces. I just type Rylands Papyrus in here, show it, right? All the information of all the libraries in the world is right here, if you know what to look for, what to ask. Okay, to me, that's that exponential growth here that God's using to bring it to the end. And, verses you're familiar with, if we go back to, say, Isaiah, chapter 46, for example. Isaiah chapter 46, and I always like to start in verse 8 because it sets the stage. Isaiah 46:8. He says, remember this and be assured, recall it to mind, you transgressors. I wonder who he's talking to there. Remember the former things long past, for I am God, there is no other. I am God, there's no one like me, declaring the end from the beginning. And from ancient times, things which have not been done, saying, my purpose will be established, and I will accomplish all my good pleasure, calling a bird of prey from the east, and man of my purpose from a far country. Truly I have spoken, truly I will bring it to pass. I have planned it. Surely I will do it. See, so that lets me know that he's planned, the growth, and he's planned the end. You've heard me say that God built it from the back end. He started the back end. He started at the climax, didn't he? Of the human race. Started at the climax, then he built it backwards to Genesis. And when he was ready, he flipped the lever and let her roll downhill. And so we're seeing the final stages of that, in my opinion, because it's global. Again, the technology, okay, can you go anywhere without being tracked? I was looking a little bit at that Idaho murder case. They're tracking this guy across the country. They identified him, with family DNA. Okay, family DNA, that's what they used. They didn't have his, but they're able to have a close match with other family members, which pointed to him being the guy. And tracked the vehicle and stopped him a couple times to get pictures along the way. They wanted to see what his hands looked like. Okay, and they tracked him with Easy Pass. If that technology turns against you, see, they always does. See, the record of the human race is what? There's guys in power that want to control everybody else, right? That's that. Pharaoh, a good example. Did he want to let the children of Israel go? Did he want freedom for the children of Israel? No. Okay, so that's the record of the human race across the board. So these guys got the technology. See, at some point, they're going to be able to shut everything down. Okay, then when that happens, the end. So it looks to me like this is why he allowed this at this time, is to bring things to the final conclusion. Further comments on that? Okay. So back to the Tower of Babel then, we have the development of written language, okay? We've got all kind of different spoken language and got the development of written language. And those guys knew who God was, okay? They knew that he executed judgment in the flood, and they knew that he scattered them from the Tower of Babel, right? So man knows, okay? But how long does it take man to forget? Okay. So it's always interesting to me, when you start thinking about Abraham, it's always interesting. Okay, so, yeah, Nick.
I've had a question going through my mind, and I thought maybe you were going to get to it, and maybe you did, and I missed it. So I'm going to ask it anyway, or maybe you're still getting there. They went from one language to many, really, in 2 verses here. And you made a comment that was quick. That wasn't like gradual.
Right.
Like overnight, like instantaneous.
Instantaneous, yeah.
Do you think then, because they came from the same family essentially too, which it would explain why they would be speaking one language, do you think that at the Tower of Babel is where we would get different colors of skin and things like that as well? Or where would that come in from a biblical perspective?
Okay, that's a good question. Of course, skin color is a matter of how much pigment do you have, okay? So the more, we'll call it pigment, the more pigment you have the, the darker your skin. Now, I'm a white guy, right? I had to mark Caucasian the other day on something I filled out, right? So here's a whiteboard, right? Is that white? Is my hand white? No. It's pigmented. It just got less pigment. Okay? So it's just variations in pigment. You go back to Genesis 10, see, and you follow it through, you can see where the descendants basically came from. In verse 2, it says the sons of Japheth. Now, Japheth was prophesied by Noah, really, that Japheth would be the most numerous. His descendants would be the most numerous on the face of the earth, okay? And so you got one thing that you'd recognize in there. It says Gomer, Magog, Madai, see Javan. If you spell that a little bit different, it comes out Ionian, and that's the Greeks. That's the Greeks right there, okay? And and you got these guys spreading out. They basically headed to Europe, all right? And in verse 6, you got the sons of Ham, Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. Those are all recognizable. Cush is Ethiopia, Mizraim's Egypt, Put's Libya, Canaan is pretty obviously Canaan, okay? And they not only went toward Africa, but of course they settled in the land of Canaan, but also in verse 8, Cush became the father of Nimrod. See, so they actually begin to settle in the Middle East as well, okay? And then you got Shem in verse 21, Elam, okay? In verse 22, Elam, that's Iran, the Persians eventually, okay? Asher, that's the Assyrians, okay? Aram, that's the Syrians, okay? So when you kind of start following this through, what we would call the Europeans or the Caucasians are the kind of the mixture of Shem and Japheth that went north. The Asians are the mixture of Ham and Japheth that went east, okay? And the Africans primarily Ham. So whether, the three sons had three different wives, okay? So how much pigmentation, was already in motion at that time, you don't know. I mean, you in your own families, you see kids, full brother, full sister that have different pigmentation and, even different eye color. And what we got to process, is all that information was originally built into the genetic code in Adam, expanded a little bit in Eve. Okay, all that information for every single one of us was there. So, what goes into pigmentation and the development of that, we don't know, but you can tell it tended to be kind of geographic the way it ended up, but it's kind of connected with the different sons of Noah's descendants going different directions. Three sons, three different so-called, it's actually one race, I'm racist, I'm for the human race and desire the salvation of all humans, okay? That's I'm a racist guy. So, see, you can see the word, the divisive effects of trying to, okay, what race are you? Well, human. And see, the government's been directly involved in that. They've been for years even making you mark on your income tax form, what race you are, what your ancestry is. See, that's designed to create division, rather than, because God's colorblind. I mean, as far as He's concerned, the human race splits into two groups: lost and saved. And He desires that all men be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth. So it started here at Babel, and that's kind of where they came from. Further thoughts on that, Nick?
You said that the genetic code was already in Adam and partially Eve, or, so there was no adaptation based on where they moved to, per se. I mean,
Can be. See, it's built into all living organisms to be able to adapt to the environment. Okay, so generally speaking, the guys in Northern Europe went north, became the blonde-haired, blue-eyed. But you know, the Asians, when they went north, they became the Eskimos. You know, they're a little bit lighter, but see, they're still Asian. See, so part of it's genetic, part of it's adaptation.
so like in Ham's case, they would have started out with fairly dark skin to begin with.
Possible.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the Egyptian tombs, you know, generally the Egyptians show up as kind of dark, and then the Ethiopians show up really dark, and you know, with other characteristics of the blacks. So it was already there by the time the Egyptians are starting to put their, you know, their drawings on the wall and their friezes and their colors. It's amazing that those colors have been preserved. You know, the paint was preserved for over, you know, nearly 5,000 years. Just incredible. So again, God wanted that. He wanted that. So that's where. So and you can kind of see if you know, you can see it's actually kind of a gradual. If you look at you know, where people are, you can actually see kind of a gradual. The Indians, for example, are called Caucasian. You know, they're dark, but they're Caucasian. You have all the Caucasian features. Okay. Now, when you get to South India, you know, where Benoit's from, you see a little bit more of Ham in there. Okay, but North India, you know, when I was talking to Alan Marshall in London, of course, Alan Marshall's British as he can be, all right? And he grew up in Pakistan. And he said, if I grow my beard out and I speak Urdu, he said, you can't tell that I'm not Pakistani. Why? Same skin color. See, because that's where the descendants of Shem primarily ended up. Okay, so you can kind of trace that back but there's gradations all the way across the board, as you'd expect. Same way with language. Okay, a little, you know, as language started out, then it kind of develops and moves on. You know, you can't read Chaucer. You can't read. I mean, you have a hard time reading Shakespeare, but Shakespeare's modern English. Okay, you move back, you know, a century or so and try to read Chaucer, you can't do it. See why? Because the language shifts. Right? So it's interesting. So in deep Germany, they'd be speaking, you know, German, but as it moves west, see, it gets closer and closer to what they speak in Holland. See, so the language for Germany is Deutsch or Dutch, right? But who are the Dutch people? Netherlands. See, because again, there's gradations of language. Those of you that you know, studied the old second edition English paces, you know that our modern English is derived a lot from Kentish. You know, I mean, there's a lot of different dialects inside England, and only a combination of a couple of those became modern English. See, that's the way language. Same way as skin color and all those sort of things. There's a lot of gradation, and then, of course, when you have a society like ours is, say in the United States of America, where you're getting a lot of intermixing, see, after a while, those will lose their identity. That's all part of God's plan. See, he set that in motion before the foundation of the world, and he determined. You know, if you go to Acts chapter 17, it's an amazing thing that God can actually orchestrate and still man use his own free will. You know. Acts chapter 17, you call this verse here, it says in verse 26, he made from one man every nation, or one blood, sometimes interpolated there, every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation. And he did so, that they would seek God if perhaps they might grope for him and find him, though he's not far from each one of us. So this is for Gary's benefit. In him we live and move and have our being. So God actually determined the appointed times and the boundaries of each nation. See, he determined when Babylon was going to come into existence, the second Babylonian kingdom, determined what its boundaries were. He determined that Assyria would rise and then instantly, almost overnight, collapse. See, he determined that. He determined the spread of the British Empire. The saying was that the sun never sets on the Union Jack. Okay, he determined that ahead of time. And so, back to kind of Matthew's question. See, he's orchestrating things. Man's using his own free will. God's orchestrating. But in the midst of that, see, what God's doing, the process of doing, is injecting information. See, that he'd like mankind to process. See, and the Tower of Babel is there for anybody to look at. It was there, they knew about it when they got spread. They refused to have God in their knowledge any longer and started worshiping idols. And when that happened, see, then God had to work with Abraham. And in Abraham, then, the key thing I was working on here was, there's situations. Abraham goes down to Egypt, and they take Sarah. Okay? And God basically puts a curse on everybody in Egypt. Okay? And then, when he intermingles with the Philistines, they do the same thing. And God puts a curse on everything there. And so what's God doing? See, he's injecting information there through that process that Isaac is special. See, Isaac should have never been born. There's a special plan. God's using this to inject information into the human race. See, and this is how he's starting to develop the idea of, no, there is one God. There is one God. And he's going to use Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and the people of Israel to start to bring that information. He can't work with the rest of the human race. What's the record with the human race? Okay. See, so he has to do something special, and the fact that he did something special means you should pay attention then to what he's doing here. Okay. So, any closing thoughts? Yeah, Andrew.
Kind of in the theme of in tangent with Acts 17, as well as the kind of the dispersion of language found in Genesis 11. I was wondering if you've looked into the consistency in language of what the entity known as the Sky Father in Latin and Greek, mostly derived from one another, but also in one document found in the Vedas, where there's this entity called the Sky Father, and where that it's and. I guess my point with this, in terms of dictating this, kind of going to the idea of being able to grope for God, I found that in a lot of cases, man can only build off of what has already been built to a degree in terms of inspiration. And the idea that Zeus is kind of dictated as this being that is kind of beyond the pantheon and kind of behind the scenes to a degree, but he's more powerful than this. And then the consistency with all the different buildings like the ziggurat and its foundation, and God is found on the top of the mountain, and how all these different facets, if you kind of read into them, actually are inspired from the concept of where the Garden of Eden was placed, and they're kind of derived from these traditions. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts in regards to that, or if you've looked into any of that.
Well, even here in Acts 17, right? Paul's talking to the Greeks. The Greek pagans, Greek idol worshippers, okay? What's he saying? He said in verse 29, being then children of God, okay, Sky Father, the Creator, we ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and thought of man. See, he goes back and appeals there in verse 28, in him we live and move and exist, as even some of your poets have said. We also are his children. See, so, ancient man across the board, at some point knew there was a creator God. by whatever name they determine to attach to that. So, and that's found, universally throughout all the religions. Okay, that there is at some point back behind there's a creator God. Just modern man gets smarter, and he gets the ability to wipe that out